I'm joined by someone who has had extensive dealings with the Chinese governments. David Mulroney was Canada's ambassador to Beijing from 2009 to 2012. Mr. Mulroney, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I guess the first question is, what do you make of John McCallum's statements this week?
Well, to be very honest, I was surprised. We've been down this road before when the Prime Minister was attempting to negotiate, to start the process of negotiating a free trade agreement with China. And clearly his preference for what's referred to as a progressive free trade agreement, one that includes things like gender, environment, labor, proved a stumbling block with the Chinese. And I'd say even with the Americans in the recent renegotiation of NAFTA, our results have been modest. So to double down now and to say that this is going to be something that we make central, and indeed we would wait to negotiate until the Chinese have changed their behavior, suggests to me that we're going to wait a long time. I tweeted this morning that it probably means we will resume negotiations in 2068.
So you think this is a signal that free trade is a long way off, or that the government really is not that keen if issues like human rights are still on the table?
I think it's a signal about a couple of things. One is there's still what I would describe as a lingering naivete in terms of how the government approaches important relationships like the relationship with China. Two, we tend to see human rights as something we prescribe, right? We come to a country and say, this is what our human rights package is going to be. Instead of looking at the country, listening to what's happening to the country, if anything, human rights issues in China far transcend any trade and investment concerns that Canada might have. China is right now in the midst of a major and appalling crackdown on religious freedom. Up to 1 million Muslim Uyghur people from the west of China are in re-education, detainment camps. There's an enormous effort to really remove religion from their society and from other parts of Chinese society. So human rights isn't something we park in a trade agreement. It's a much larger issue that we need to contend with.
Okay, but I mean, I guess the question is, and just to know where you're coming from, should then human rights be put aside in terms of negotiating access to the Chinese market?
Human rights, I think of our relationship with a country as having multiple channels. And human rights is a very important channel. In fact, I would say human rights right now with China is more important even than free trade. And we should be joining with others to challenge what China is doing at home and increasingly abroad. That said, China is the second largest economy in the world, and some say maybe the largest economy in the world. I think that still remains to be seen. And it's central to Canadian prosperity. So we do need to be sure that there's a level playing field for selling Canadian resources and for selling Canadian technology. I note that Ministers Carr and Morneau are going to China next month, and that's a good thing. So we should be pragmatic when it comes to ensuring that Canadian exporters can sell what it is that they produce on the Chinese market, that we're granted as good access to China as we provide to China and to Chinese exporters. And at the same time, we need to keep up a really active human rights program, but one that is much more focused on what's actually happening in China rather than what we think the Chinese need.
Okay, well, if we look then, if we look on the trade aspects particularly, and you mentioned the Ministers Carr and Ministers Morneau going to China on November 11th, I think they're leaving. If we look at what they should be looking at, to what extent do you think the Canadian government is also watching other partners with China, for example, like Australia, which has already signed a free trade deal with China, but which is finding China's follow-through has been far from predictable and far from desirable in terms of living up to some of the commitments to free trade in that Australian deal?
Yes, and it took, I mean, the Chinese and the Australians famously negotiated for 10 years to get to that deal. So there's no panacea, there are no shortcuts. What you're trying to do through any kind of agreement you sign with the Chinese is to marginally improve the situation, and it means you'll have to come back again and again and again to check for Chinese backsliding. That said, China is a place that is susceptible to activity and to intervention by government. When I was ambassador, the Chinese blocked access to their market for Canadian canola, which is an agricultural product primarily from Western Canada. And it took multiple visits by then Agriculture Minister Jerry Ritz, by the Canola Council of Canada, and even interventions by the Prime Minister, that was then Prime Minister Harper, but we got the market reopened. And I think they have since closed it, and the Trudeau government has gone to similar lengths. So China's a market you have to work on very, very diligently. The government plays a key role, and will continue to play a key role. But it's going to be, every step is one you have to fight for.
Okay, let's weigh in on something that is also very topical, and that is we've just seen the release of the agreement, the USMCA, the new NAFTA. Second NAFTA, renegotiated NAFTA, and there is this thing that's now been called the China Clause, and that is almost a virtual prohibition or an ability to have a veto from one of the partners if Canada were to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. The other two partners could walk. Now, a lot of people have said that that's already in there, but it's specifically now mentioning a potential deal with a non-market economy. What do you make of how that might affect Canada's negotiations with China?
Well, I think what we're missing, and what's missing in the Canadian debate, which is tending to, I think, dismiss or minimize what it is that the Americans appear to be doing. First of all, I think that's a mistake. Second, it fails to take into account what's happening between China and the United States. So military and security tension is rising. The Americans, I think, are finally responding more effectively to the Chinese buildup in the South China Sea. And America has taken unprecedented trade measures against China, which has caught the Chinese off guard and is really sending shockwaves through their economy. So America is increasingly identifying China as a security threat. If we think that we can proceed as we did in the past without any kind of repercussions on the North American front, I think we're kidding ourselves. So this is not something that's going to go away. It means that we probably have to do a really good job of explaining to folks in Washington what it is that we're doing. We need to find allies, but it's getting more complicated, not less complicated.
I was going to say that compared to the time when you were there from 2009 to 2012, does it mean that now any Canadians dealing with China, and that includes our government, they really are more constrained because they're going to have to be checking with Washington? That's one of the interpretations that's made of this new free trade agreement with Washington.
Well, one of the things we have to think about, and which we don't tend to think about, is what's motivating the other players. So the United States right now sees China as a strategic threat in ways that the Obama administration didn't and probably should have. So that's captivating attention in Washington. The Chinese, meanwhile, are going to be really worried that this new activist approach by the United States will make other countries unwilling to trade with them. And they would like nothing more than to have a country like Canada on the doorstep of the United States enter into a free trade negotiation. So we may find ourselves in a bit of a tug of war, and we may need to think in ways that we haven't thought in the past about where our interests really lie. Now, Ambassador McCallum got himself into some hot water earlier in the year when he sort of suggested that we now have more in common with China than we do with the United States. That's not a totally accurate quotation, but this was how his remarks were interpreted. I don't think that's true. As distasteful as the Trump administration is, we are still a Western country, and our interests align much more closely with those of the United States than they do with China. So we may be faced with a new world through which we have to negotiate, and a much more, as I say, much more difficult world. And we're going to have to make some real choices and think really seriously about the decisions we make out there in the wider world.
Okay, David Mulroney, I want to thank you very much for taking the time, and we will speak again on this issue without doubt. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.